Agriculture has never been simple. It's shaped by weather and markets, policy and politics, forces that often originate far from the farm gate. Headlines move fast, policies shift, markets react, but the impact of those changes doesn't just show up on screen, it shows up on farms and ranches, in families and rural communities. This podcast is about taking the time to explore what's happening in agriculture and what it means for the people living it, with clarity, context, and perspective. I'm Corryn La Rue, and this is Farm Unfiltered. European farmer protests are putting fresh attention on a global trade deal that's been decades in the making, and one that could reshape agricultural markets far beyond Europe. The agreement, known as the EU-Mercosur trade deal, would link the European Union with several South American countries, including Brazil and Argentina, creating a combined market of roughly 700 million people. But the deal is facing strong resistance from farmers across Europe, especially in France, where protests have intensified in recent months. To understand why, we turn to economists and trade experts following the negotiations closely. Joining us now is Arlen Suderman, Chief Commodities Economist at StoneX. He says the goal is to open trade between two regions with very different economic strengths: South America's resource-rich agriculture and Europe's consumer and manufactured goods sector. Suderman cautions that the deal is far from guaranteed.
Yeah, and there's the key there. It still needs to be ratified, and there's some people in Europe who really had to swallow a bitter pill to accept this. And so it's not a sure thing, but it does seem to be moving forward. I think a big concern that we see in Europe, and particularly among European farmers, is the fact that they operate under very strict environmental rules that really restrict what they're able to do, much tighter than what the farmer in Brazil, Argentina, for that matter, is. And in fact, Brazil is kind of the focal point of deforestation accusations as far as deforesting the rainforest, and that really gets under the skin of the Europeans. But when you look at the environmental regulations that the European farmer has to live under, he has to have a higher price in order to accept that, because environmental regulations are expensive to comply with. And he feels like it's going to be an unfair advantage for the South American farmer competing, sending commodities into Europe, and that's going to be bad for the European farmers in his view.
Environmental regulations like the EU's anti-deforestation rule requires any commodities coming in to be documented as coming from a region that hasn't been deforested in recent years. While that rule has been delayed several times, Suderman says it's another sticking point and will play a role in the implementation of this trade agreement. Bill Wirtz, a senior policy analyst with the Consumer Choice Center, says many European farmers see the Mercosur deal as unfair competition, raising production costs and undercutting their markets. That concern is playing out on the streets of Paris, mixed with other protests against regulatory issues.
There have been ongoing protests. They sort of mixed together with other protests about regulation. So it was sometimes hard to tell because you would have protest signs both ways. But it's been especially since last year now that it's been really against this agreement, because it was still out. Like nobody knew whether the French president was going to approve this deal or not. In the end, France did not vote in favor of the agreement, but it had enough of a majority to pass. It will be an ongoing battle about ratification, because all the signatory countries will also need to ratify the deal, and that's a multi-year process that can take an elongated period of time. But now that it's signed, it means that that some of the provisions are already in effect. Now the protests are the protest similar to other protests we've seen in the past in France, spraying manure, blocking roads, setting hay bales on fire. It's what we know from farmer protests around Europe already, and the demands are specific to not sign this deal because of the competition that comes out of Argentina when it comes to beef, or soybeans when they come out of Brazil, that are not just cheaper, but they're also cheaper because they're being able to be produced under regulatory standards that are different to the EU. The EU has stricter standards, and farmers are protesting because they say this is unfair competition.
Okay. And, would you like to just go into the difference between the protests against the regulatory versus trade?
Yeah, so about 5 years ago, we had the farm to fork strategy being unveiled in the European Union, and what that meant was that the EU wanted to have the most environmentally oriented piece of legislation towards improving farming's climate change impact. And what I wanted to do was cut about half of all the synthetic pesticides, reduce fertilizer use, reduce agricultural land use by 10%, and increase organic agriculture from between 8 and 10% to 25%. And this was a very significant plan. And what farmers said was, look, I mean, if you make us produce under these circumstances, then we're not going to be able to make a living anymore. And that's why a lot of the protests broke out, especially in the Netherlands, and then spread all over Europe. This plan has been taken off the table. So this is not happening anymore. Okay. The European Union has walked that back. And so on the regulatory side, farmers have won on this in this place. And now what we also see on the Commission side, on the European Commission side, which is the executive arm of the European Union, is that it now simplifies, which, they try to find a different way to say deregulate, but ultimately it's deregulation to make the lives easier for farmers, especially small farmers had a lot of environmental checks, a lot of people coming on the farm to check on whether you're doing it right, and a lot of paperwork to fill out, multiple pages for every grant to fill out. Many farmers needing to employ compliance people to be able to skim through all the paperwork that is associated with farming in Europe. So we have some good news on that. In my personal view, unfortunately, there's still some hesitancy towards trade. My view is that even though there is competition that comes out of these trade agreements, there's also many opportunities. And there's opportunities to export European goods that are very desired around the world. I know, for instance, American consumers do like French cheeses and wine and all that thing. There's major opportunities when there's trade agreements to remove tariffs and be able to find new markets to export to.
Even beyond Mercosur, Europe is pushing ahead with multiple trade deals. Just days after finalizing the South American agreement, the European Union is expected to announce a separate trade pact with India, ending nearly 20 years of negotiations and creating one of the largest free trade relationships in the world. For U.S. farmers, these deals matter. Expanded access between Europe and South America could change competition for soybeans, beef, and other commodities in global export markets. And once trade flows shift, regaining lost market share can take years. As the Mercosur deal moves through the ratification process, questions remain about enforcement, environmental rules, and how much trade will actually occur. But the protests in Paris are already making one thing clear. Decisions made overseas are increasingly shaping the future of global agriculture. That's it for today. As always, the goal here is to better understand what's happening in agriculture and what it means beyond the headlines. I'm Corryn La Rue, and this is Farm Unfiltered.